Welcome back to the Families of Florence. In this session, we will focus on an introduction to Tkinter. So our long-term aim is to rebuild a graphical user interface that looks a little bit like the one I constructed. Of course, as I discussed before, we don't necessarily have to end up with the same solution. Now, Tkinter is quite well documented, so you just look for Tkinter and you start with a very simple minimum working example. So when you just scroll a little bit down, you see the basic building blocks, and then from there we start adding more and more complexity. But basically down here we have a simple hello world example, so I just take that and copy paste this into my text editor. So I'm using Sublime Text, but you can use anything you wish, and then we just run it and see what happens. And quite often things might not work as intended, and I just want to, keep everything in the video, so don't edit all the problems away, because, well, you will actually face these problems in real life, and we have to discuss how to handle it and also how to read documentation. Now, the first thing before we actually run it is to notice that you have actually two import statements. So I would just import as follows. So import Tkinter, and I would do it as tk. So that would not run because we introduced Tkinter here as tk. So if to modify this, so that should do it. Then we have a frame popping up. We leave that in. And then we have to talk about grids and other things. I modify this as well. So we have a label, and we have a button, and then we have the main loop here. And I talk about all these elements. Let me now just run this and see how that looks like. And you see you run straight away into an error because there is an unknown option padding. So that might have changed over time, so that's quite possible. So we go back in here and remove it. So this option doesn't seem to exist as suggested. So these things happen. So don't expect that documentation is perfect. Usually it's not. And we run it again and see what happens. And now we have our massively exciting graphic user interface. Now this doesn't look really impressive. I'll make it a bit bigger. So that's it. Yeah, so that's our graphic user interface. That is very basic. And you see now a button emerging where you can press on it and it's quitting. So it's basically an exit button, and it goes out. It destroys the root. So let me now just talk about the different elements. So it's good, it works, so that's fine. So we can get rid of that. We have our import statement tkinter as tk. So this is generating our root. So our root is our basic canvas. So that's the graphical user interface. So this here is starting the root, but most importantly, the main loop keeps it running. Whenever you run a Python script, it just runs it through. Once you hit the end, it stops. But here you don't want it to stop. You want it to continue. And that's the whole idea also of playing this game. You want this whole thing to continue until the game is over. Now, how is the game over in this particular simple case? Well, when you press the button, and we come to this in a minute. It's important to notice when you work with Tkinter, this always has to be there and has to be at the end of your graphical user interface is equal to tk.frame. Now what this does is it refers to a frame class, and it initializes an instance, and you assign this instance to FRM. And then you refer to this frame, the instance you created, and you use the grid method. Now, there are two ways to place items on your graphic user interface in Tkinter. One is the pack method and one is the grid method. The grid method works according to columns and rows. So it's like a matrix. The pack method just lets the Tkinter decide where to put it. So in most cases, I work with grid and specify exactly where I want to have it placed. So you see further below in this line 14 for the label that you use the grid method all in one go. So basically line 14 creates a label. This label is placed on the frame, so it refers to FIM, which is the frame I created on root. It has a text, which is of course hello world, and then we place the label using grid. It's placed in column 0 and row 0, so this is exactly the starting point. Now it's important to notice that these numbers here are not absolute, they are always relative. So this is how Tkinter would operate. So if I put, for instance, instead of 1 here 10, it would not make any difference. It's a relative placement. So it goes into the column which is to the right of the starting point where we have our label. You can, if you wish, do everything in one line. So here you see a solution where you have it actually in 2 lines of code, where you first create your object, like the frame, and then you place it. You will notice later, once you have not just one frame, but maybe 4 or 5 and maybe 40 different buttons, that the method doing it all in one line can get quite quickly quite messy. So actually this tends to be the better approach. Now let me modify this a little bit. So usually I would also refer here to column and row and think about the positioning. So that would be useful. And here we have different labels. So usually I group stuff together. So we have frames, we have labels, and we have buttons. So here we go. And as you can see, we can now modify how grid is placed. So usually here I would also name it as label. Later we might call this label 1, 2, 3, or we might refer to a label for a particular frame. So in this particular case we can also do something like that. So I know exactly that this is a label which refers to our first frame. And then what we do is we do the grid in the next line. And for buttons, we do something similar. And again, it's on our frame here. So it's a little bit of a tidy up, but now it's a bit easier to see the structure. Personally, I like it more in this way. It's a bit more writing, but later it's easier to find the spot of your columns and rows. And I tell you, once it gets a bit more complex, you will appreciate that. Quit is not the best one. Let's use exit. And now the next thing you notice is you see the command here. So the command is executing a function. So usually in Python, when you call a function, you have open closed brackets. Yeah. To be precise, what this actually is doing is it refers to root and it's calling a method. But the same applies here. So usually for a method call, you would have open closed brackets. In this particular case, you notice it's not open close brackets, and the reason for that is it's only executed once you press the button. If I now run it as you see it on the screen, it would immediately use the destroy method, which kills my whole graphical user interface. We can simply test it now. So now it basically gets a little bit puzzled, so it can't invoke a button command because the application has been already destroyed. So it's basically immediately executing the destroy method. We don't want that. Yeah, so this is why we remove the open close brackets. So that's a little bit confusing in the beginning. Just a little bit of spaces here. I always like to keep a bit of space to make it easier to read. And here we go. Now the first thing we should fix is it's simply ridiculously small. Yes, I want to make it a little bit bigger. So that's that would be a good starting point, and then later we think about other features. Yeah, so to make it bigger, we can adjust the size using geometry. So I refer to my root when I use the geometry method, and then I can specify the size actually using a string. You see the double quotation marks, so this is a string. Yeah, so that's certainly better. Maybe a little bit too big, we might modify this further. We can just play around a little bit. Let's do 500, 600, something like that. So here we go. So that looks reasonable. Good. The next thing I would like to do is to have the title, because at the moment we don't have that. So here we just have TK as a title, so this is a default, not very exciting. So it would be nice to have our families of Florence popping up here. And that can be easily done using the title method on our root, and we just call this families of Florence. And now we have a very basic, super basic GUI. Of course, this doesn't look at all what we want it to look like, because in the original one we have menu bars and lots of different functions. And of course, it will take us a while to get there. I see you in the next session.